2, 3. Are we on? Okay. So the last section in this unit is called section 3.4. Let me actually go to the page, right? So in 3.4, because the grouping of the fallacies works a little bit better in 3.2 and 3.3. So in this one, we have fallacies of presumption, fallacies of ambiguity, and fallacies of illicit transference. So fallacies of ambiguity only have equivocation and amphibole, and illicit transference only has the fallacies composition and division, right? And then fallacies of presumption are 4 or 5 fallacies, right? And these fallacies arise because the premises are irrelevant to the conclusion or provide insufficient reason for believing the conclusion. Not because of that, but because the premises presume what they purport to prove. So they presuppose the virtue of the argument, even if the argument's not any good. Now, begging the question, let me go back to marker and board just for a second, right? So I want to explain something first to you. Now, the fallacy of begging the question is often called circular reasoning, begging the question, right? Equals circular reasoning. That's its most famous version, although the infographic goes a little bit more into detail as to how having a shaky premise to advance a conclusion when more needs to be proven, you actually presuppose the sturdiness of the premise, even though you're employing a shaky premise at best, right? So those are also contained in this variety. But what I want you to notice is if I were to argue and try to establish something, right? So if somebody said, God, how about this? I know I use a lot of examples, philosophy from religion, because I do philosophy of religion as a research subspecialty. But here's a circular argument. The Bible mentions the word God. Therefore, God exists. Now, this is known as circular reasoning, right? The premise is contained in the conclusion, and the conclusion is contained in the premise. So it's kind of a circle. Sort of think about this. If I were running track right now, and this is the starting line, like this little thing in the classroom that's like where the power cords are, let's just say that's the block where you start and track, and the ref is over there, and the ref has got the cap gun, right? And the ref goes, and all the people start running. And I'm like, I figured this out. I'm just going to stay here. I'd be like, I'm done. And I yell at the ref that I'm done because I started where I'm supposed to end up. But did I run the race by definition? No, I did not, right? So you'll notice here, circular reasoning is that the premise is contained here and the conclusion is contained in the premise. It's like claiming you ran a race from the starting position that's also defined as the finish line. You haven't gone anywhere, right? In fact, you've just restated the same thing in different words, and you've completed a circle. But this also brings up why we've been going over the formal definition of an argument, because an argument has different parts, premises and the conclusion. So ask yourself this question. Why is the premise, why are the premise or premises always different than the conclusions they support or advance? Pause to consider. So the reason why the premises are different than the conclusion is that you wouldn't go anywhere if they were the same. If you're just restating the conclusion in the premise, then you're not actually offering any independent reasons to someone as to why they should accept the conclusion. Now, I'm using the argument for God's existence, right? But there are other better philosophical arguments that we would go over in Intro to Philosophy about God's existence that would be better arguments along the standards of using logic to advance a conclusion for God's existence. Let me just give you one example of a better argument than this one, right? Now, of course, you might say to me, well, Dr. Hackett, wouldn't this argument succeed in like a church setting? Yes, it would. But no one in church is trying to accept their beliefs based on logic. Maybe some are, right? But the point of it is having faith in something is a lot different than playing the game of logic. Because if the game of logic is to always support our beliefs with evidence, then there is also philosophical reasoning that would go into establishing the conclusion in exactly that way. So take, for instance, right, if nature is ordered, then nature implies the existence of some cause for that design, or I'll say for a designer. Yeah, okay, that works. So if nature's ordered, then nature implies the existence of some cause for a designer, right? And then, of course, this is premise one, which you recognize as a conditional statement, right? So let's put this in modus ponens. Premise two. Nature is ordered. Conclusion. Therefore, then nature implies the existence of some cause for a designer. And I'm capitalizing designer because I mean like a cosmic designer like God. Right now, this is technically what we might call the argument from design. It's a philosophical argument. It tries to, and it conforms to having a valid argument structure, right? And then, of course, and if this premise is true and it's a valid argument, then the conclusion can't help but be true, right? So the question here is, it's a valid argument form, but are my premises sound? Does nature have the order you're claiming to imply the existence of a cosmic designer? But this plays the game of logic, and it plays it well. Now, of course, is there flaws with this argument? What does it mean for nature to be ordered? All of that is answered with different thinkers, right? But again, this is the way to play the logic game, to argue for God's existence, but not to have a circular one, right? And you'll notice the other reason to sort of put this here before doing the fallacies is that this premise and this premise have to be different in order to advance the conclusion. And it's different to a degree. We're using a conditional statement. If there really truly is design in nature, then that implies the existence of a cosmic designer, right? There is some order in nature. That can be no doubt. Now, all the order in nature, if we take that together, does that imply the existence of God? Interesting philosophical question, right? And is there a problem with this argument? Again, those are questions for Intro to Philosophy or a philosophy religion course. But I think you get the point. The philosophical reasoning behind this is a lot different than just saying, you know, the Bible says God exists, therefore it's true, right? And we can also motivate the same conclusion in a different way. We could say, for instance, right? We could say something like, my professor says God doesn't exist. Therefore, there is no God. So this is a circular argument. Now, the thing that makes begging the question kind of hard to pinpoint is sometimes the premise is worded so differently than the conclusion that it doesn't appear very easy to detect. But does the premise restate the conclusion, and is the conclusion restated in the premise? That's what makes the circular reasoning. Now, of course, let's go to the book. And the book actually has a really sophisticated approach because there's basically 1.5 more modalities that create 3 versions of the fallacy. But it's all called begging the question. There's no sub-varieties or different names that you need to know. So let's go to it, right? So the first example is that there's a shaky key premise that's really missing from the conclusion, right? And in order to complete the argument, you would actually need the shaky premise. That's the example of the first one. So murder is morally wrong. This being the case, it follows that abortion is morally wrong. What's the missing premise that would complete this? But on its own, this is still begging the question because the argument is presupposing what? Pause to consider. It's presupposing that abortion is murder. And isn't that really what the question of the argument should be trying to prove? So this one is missing that key premise that would complete this moral argument, right? Other times, how about this one? We know that humans are intended to eat lots of fruit because the human hand and arm are perfectly suited for picking fruit from a tree. Pause to consider. Well, what's missing here? What are we presupposing here? That's right. We are presupposing that this one use of the hand to pick fruit is the purpose of the hand, which actually gets you the argument, right? But you seem to be presupposing what is essentially at issue. And what's at issue is that this is a premise indicator, the word because, right? The human hand and arm are perfectly suited for picking fruit from a tree. Yeah, but, human having graspable hands, right, also means that human hands are good for praying. Human hands are good for making tools. Human hands are good for picking up meat from a bone. And they're also good at picking fruit. So how is it that you just sort of narrowed in on the fact that hands are solely for picking fruit when we can use the fact that we have opposable thumbs and we're pentadactyl, we have 5 digits, right, in order to do all those things that confer evolutionary advantage upon us, right? So you're presupposing the very thing that you need to prove. That's what's kind of circular here, right? And then, but number 2, I think, is the most common one where we restate the premise and the premise restates the conclusion. And when there's one premise, one conclusion, it's very easy to spot. Other times, if there's 2 or 3 premises and a conclusion and it's circular, it's kind of hard to spot. And then, of course, we can just keep rewording the conclusion in different ways with number 2 in mind. And this is kind of like what I call the 1.5 over here, right? So there's a really great example of this with the Verizon example. All right, so Verizon has the best wireless service. After all, their phones have the clearest sound. And we know this because customers hear better on Verizon phones. And this follows from the fact that Verizon has digital technology. But this is exactly what you would expect, given that Verizon has the best wireless service. So I just said Verizon has the best wireless service. And that best wireless service there's not differentiated from having the clearest sound and then hearing better, right? It all means the same thing. So it's all kind of this right here. You have a shaky premise and a conclusion. You're just saying it in different ways, right? So I've never really seen examples of number 3 except like kind of advertising, but 1 and 2, kind of hard sometimes to spot. 1, 2 is the most common variety of begging the question, right? I know that's like 10 minutes on just one of these. The fallacy of complex question are easy to spot. Again, these are the only fallacies that actually end in a question. And like against the person fallacies, they always occur more or less in dialogue or conversation with the people they're intending to, right? So fallacy of complex question is committed when 2 or more questions are combined in the guise of a single question And the purpose of using a complex question is to trap someone rhetorically with the assumptions of what are behind the question. You want to, and so anyone using complex question on you is trying to manipulate you with unreasonable tactics to get you to accept something that they want you to accept, right? So the example in our book, have you stopped cheating on exams? Well, if you accept this as a yes or no question, like, have you stopped cheating on exams? Yes. It implies that you at one time did cheat. If you answer no to this question, then that implies that you're actually still cheating on exams. Now, you see how unfair of a question that is? Like, have you stopped cheating on exams, or did you stop today? Or however you might want to phrase that. But that is really, really mean to do to someone, right? Now, of course, the fallacy of complex question is how older siblings have been kind of manipulating their younger siblings since the dawn of time. But it also could be like, you know, your RA comes in and said, where did you hide the marijuana you were smoking? And if you answer like over there, it implies that you were smoking it, right? If you answer nowhere, you see what I mean, right? So you were asked, where you hid the marijuana you were smoking? You replied, under the bed. It follows that you were in fact smoking marijuana, but if you answer nowhere, it follows that you must have smoked all of it, right? So someone's trying to imply that you're the marijuana smoker in the dorm room when maybe that's not even clearly the case. But fallacy of complex question occurs only when the people who are asked the question accept the question at face value. So here's a little critical thinking kind of addendum. Always be aware of the rhetorical intentions of people when they're asking you questions, because sometimes they might be fishing for more information, or they want you to accept the assumptions behind how they're asking the question when it would imply your guilt or innocence, right? So be aware as to how questions are put to you, especially in any situation where your signature is involved, or where the law is involved, or where some sort of disciplinary action may be involved, right? Always be aware. And the only response that I can say as your logic teacher to the fallacy of complex question, always respond back with something like, well, I actually don't accept the premises or assumptions that are behind your question. And you could honestly say, I think you're trying to trap me by fallacy of complex question, because you're trying to imply A and B simultaneously, no matter how I answer. And that's, you know, that's kind of a bullshit move, right? So, and like the other ones, here's the infographic. They attempt to trap you by asking you a question to the reader or listener, and how they respond kind of completes the argument. But it only completes the fallacious argument if you accept the grounds under which the question was asked from, right? And again, in terms of the test, like, did you cheat on exams in the past, or were you smoking marijuana, yada, 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 you'll notice that they all end in a question mark. This is the only fallacy that ends in a question mark. And I say that because some students confuse begging the question with complex question because they have question in the title of their name, right? But begging the question is the circular one, and then complex question is the one that has the question mark, actually, the actual question. Fallacy of false dichotomy is basically a false either or. False dichotomy is always going to present itself as an either or, right? So I might have used the example in class already, as I've done many times already, but either student is going to get an A or an F in this class. Now, this dichotomy, to maintain that, ignores what? Yes, the fact that there are B and C students as well, right? So the fact is, and D students, like if you said like either students will pass, fail, or receive an incomplete in my class, those are really technically all the options. But someone who's committing false dichotomy wants you to accept their oversimplified version of two options that are mutually exclusive, but they're truly not, right? And so let's change Lady Gaga to NBA Youngboy. Either you let me attend the NBA Youngboy concert or I'll be miserable for the rest of my life. And you don't want me to be miserable for the rest of my life, so therefore you'll let me go to the concert, right? Now, this is disjunctive syllogism as we learned it as a valid argument structure, but pretending that there are only two options here, right? So either we adopt a one world government or we fight regional wars forever. Well, we certainly can't tolerate constant war, therefore we must adopt a one world government. Like, we can't have peace amongst the nations that do exist? So anyway, the point is, anyone that pretends that their either or is mutually exclusive when it's truly not, that's the fallacy of false dichotomy, giving someone a false sense of that these are the only two options in this either or that there ever could be. And you recognize that there are certainly more options than what are presented to you, right? So pretending that those are the only two options, that's really what is fallacious here. 18, the fallacy of suppressed evidence. I spend a lot of time on this in class when I do teach it, even though, but fallacy of suppressed evidence. I may have started this class with the fact that premise one, there are clouds in the sky. Conclusion, it's going to snow today. Now, I'm recording this on July 20th, 2022. You and I both know that there is definitely no snow on the ground in July. So suppressed evidence is basically ignoring, it's ignoring really key details that would support a very different conclusion. So it's someone purposely ignoring evidence in such a glaring way. Now, the reason to sort of stop just alongside this one is this is a really interesting one, because this also kind of corresponds to, do you remember the total evidence requirement in 1.4? That to determine cogency for an inductive argument, we need the total evidence. So all the relevant details of all the evidence should be on hand and in the premises to advance a conclusion. So suppressed evidence is defying the total evidence required also in inductive arguments. But certainly you can have suppressed evidence for deductive arguments just the same, right? But most of the real world examples we're going to focus with are kind of on. So most dogs are friendly and pose no threat to people who pet them. Therefore, it would be safe to pet the little dog that's approaching us right now. Now, if you maintain that argument, but also noted that the dog is foaming at the mouth, as our book says, then you're committing the fallacy of suppressed evidence, right? All right, so here is my favorite example of the fallacy of suppressed evidence. And this comes from Mitt Romney during a presidential debate with Barack Obama. He said the U.S. military has fewer battleships, M1 rifles, and horse-drawn howitzers today than it did in 1941. Therefore, the U.S. military is less effective fighting force today than it was in 1940. Now, let's just take a picture of what a horse-drawn howitzer. Let's just take a look at that, right? These are really good examples, right? So do you think the U.S. military is a less effective fighting force because they don't have this stuff anymore? Now, they were using these in World War II. Granted, they were using them in World War I, right? They were using stationary artillery. They were mostly digging trenches to advance, right, to come in contact with people. So that's true. But, you know, do you think the modern day soldier with GPS and satellite intel who calls in an airstrike from a US destroyer that's like 200 miles away, and then they bombard the positions of the guards, and then they advance in coordinating with air support, they coordinate all these things together with the modern conveniences of technology, satellite recon? Do you think that we are at any disadvantage from the 1940 technology that we had? Absolutely not, right? So again, so basically the premises ignore stronger evidence that would support a different conclusion, but you ignore the evidence on purpose. Now, there is another form of suppressed evidence that I do want to talk about with you today, but we do want to talk about the fact that another form of suppressed evidence is committed by arguers who quote passages out of context from source material. Now, that source material could be the Bible, the Constitution, or the Bill of Rights, but someone basically cuts apart and takes out of context passages that they use to support things that would not be supported by that, right? So people do this. Now, this right here, I think Heller VDC kind of threw that away, or is it Heckler VDC? But anyway, that's a really bad example right now because there's actually a court case that says something completely contrary to that. So I don't use that example anymore. But at the same time, people say that there should be no law about guns that we own. And there is this passage right before a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of the free state, comma, the right of people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed, period. That's technically how the punctuation of the Constitution works. And people will always cite the Second Amendment as the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed, but they ignore the fact that it says a well-regulated militia, which makes us think that maybe having some legislation about owning private ownership of guns is necessary or is constitutionally okay, because owning such a firearm was also that you volunteered in a militia. So again, the Second Amendment is taken outside of its historical context all the time, depending on where you are on that partisan issue. The Bible is similarly, or any religious text, it can be read super literally and out of context, or you can learn the languages and learn the passages in the context of what the biblical passage is actually supporting. Right? There's good and bad interpretations of the Bible, just as there are good and bad interpretations of the U.S. Constitution. Of course, this is the summer of Dobbs v. Jackson, so I wanted you to pay attention to a little bit of the fallacy of suppressed evidence. Now, fallacies. So basically, all of these fallacies are the fallacies of presupposing what you're going to prove. Like you presuppose your own conclusion if you selectively present text out of context, right? Now, the fallacies of ambiguity concern language. Now, equivocation is basically the fallacy that occurs when the conclusion of an argument depends on the fact that a word or phrase is used in two different senses, either explicitly or implicitly in the argument. So what's that mean? Well, I think the best example in the whole book is actually right in front of you in the second one, right? So let's pay attention to that. And it reads, any law, so premise one, any law can be repealed by the legislative authority. Premise two, but the law of gravity is a law. Therefore, the law of gravity can be repealed by the legislative authority. Now, this is funny. We're in Baton Rouge. We're in the state capital of Louisiana, right? And they do make laws over at the state capitol, right? They do our budgets for our public university, etc. And they do repeal laws and they do make new ones. That's what legislatures do. However, are we using the law in two different senses in this example? Is the law of gravity as a law different than what laws are repealed by the legislature? Pause to consider. Yes. There is such a thing as a political law, like the laws on the books, and a scientific law. And we're equivocating on the definition because in one sentence, any law can be repealed by the legislative authority. We're using the law as in the political sense. And then the second premise, the law of gravity is a law, is using the word law in terms of like the scientific law, right? So in using, and the big thing here is you always want to make sure that whatever technical term or phrase you're using in your premises, you're only using it one way, right? So anyway, and of course, you get really interesting ones. You can have like this one right here. A mouse is an animal, therefore a large mouse is a large animal. Well, you're equivocating on the word large because a large mouse, what's a large mouse? Is a large mouse like the size of a fist, like 2 fists big? That could be a large mouse, but is a large mouse a large animal? By large animal, I mean like hippopotamus or giraffe, something like that, right? So when I use the phrase large animal, I mean something very different than a large mouse. So by adding the word large to mouse and large to animal, given this premise over here, I'm actually equivocating on the word large, and I'm using it in 2 different ways. And it doesn't matter where the usage occurs, if it occurs in the premises alone or if it occurs in the premise and the conclusion. The point is you should only use a phrase or word one way in both all your premises and conclusion. Amphibole is kind of fun. Amphibole is, there's a lot of dangling participles, but other than word usage and phrase usage, all the other elements of syntax are covered by the fallacy of amphibole, right? And because I teach in an English department, right, I think that this is basically where we might be, right? But here's an old sentence from when I was in 8th grade. We laughed about it so much that it stuck in my mind. Nailed to the fence, Doug saw the sign. Conclusion, Doug must be bleeding. Now, amphibole is fun because the ambiguity of how we structure language, right? But this is the wrong conclusion drawn from premise 1's ambiguity, right? And this is the fallacy. I'm drawing the wrong conclusion based on the ambiguity of the sentence. So nailed to the fence, Doug saw the sign. This is technically a dangling participle, and a dangling participle is a verb, right, that we add ed or ing to, and we turn it into a participle phrase. And this acts as an adjective modifying a noun. And the nouns in this sentence are sign and Doug. So if I move the dangling participle away from the word sign, it sounds like it's modifying the word Doug, and it sounds like Doug is nailed to the fence looking at a sign, right? When really it's Doug saw the sign nailed to the fence. So and sometimes it's a prepositional phrase or dangling participle, but it could be any syntactical ambiguity of how I construct sentences that makes me draw the wrong conclusion. That's technically the fallacy of amphibole, right? And I think that, let me just go to the book because there's a problem in the homework that's a better example than anything I could just throw at you, including this. All right, so let's just go to that example in the homework. Number four, James said that he saw a picture of a beautiful girl stashed in Stephen's locker. We can only conclude that Stephen has broken the rules because girls are not allowed in the locker room, right? Now, what's going on here? Is there a phrase that if we placed it anywhere else would clear up the fact that Stephen technically never had a girl stuffed in his locker? What was in his locker was a picture, right? So this phrase, stashed in Stephen's locker, right, is next to beautiful girl, but if it were next to the word picture, the fallacy of amphibole would not be occurring here. So where you put the phrase stashed in Stephen's locker in the previous sentence, right? And sometimes bad writing includes the placement of certain phrases. So, so how to put this? If you are in English 101 or 102 this semester or in the past semester, and some professor said, can you disambiguate this claim, or can you clarify this sentence, or awkward phrasing, they might be concerned that something like the fallacy of amphibole might be harming your inability to make a clear argument. And the clearer your passages and the clearer your writing, the less ambiguity and syntactical problems your writing will have that will affect your argument. But amphibole is a good thing to just sort of think about just in terms of relating to writing papers in other classes, right? So here's the infographic. The premises have an ambiguous statement, some feature of language that is not word usage or phrase usage, right? And then the conclusion is a misinterpretation of that statement that makes us an error, right? Fallacy of composition and the fallacy of division are the last two fallacies that we're going to study in this unit, and we've reached the end. So I actually like the first example, but basically the fallacy of composition is called illicit transference because we assume that any attribute of the parts are wrongly transferred to the whole that are made up by those parts, when really the property that is on the part side is just on the part side. So consider this example. Maria likes anchovies. She also likes chocolate ice cream. Therefore, it's certain that she would like chocolate sundae topped with anchovies. Now, this just sounds gross to me, but I think it's a really wonderful example. If this wasn't an asynchronous class, what I would be doing is I ask my students like what's their favorite food and what's their flavor of ice cream, and I kind of enact this very thing more tailored to the personal preferences of a student in class. But just to show you, the anchovies having the property favorable food and chocolate ice cream having the property favorable food doesn't necessarily mean that these two things would be liked by the same person who likes them, right? So basically, this fallacy is committed when the conclusion of an argument depends on the erroneous transference of an attribute or property from the parts of something onto the whole. So composition goes from parts to whole, right? And then division goes from the whole to the parts. So let's take a look at division. Division is the exact same reverse, right? So division, the fallacy of division occurs when the conclusion of an argument depends on the erroneous transference of an attribute or property from the whole onto the parts or members of that whole. So I really like this one. Salt is a non-poisonous compound, right? So salt is sodium chloride, right? NaCl. Therefore, its component elements, sodium and chlorine, are non-poisonous. And all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, I'm not going to drink chlorine. Of course you're not going to drink chlorine. You've grown up in the South. You've been swimming in pools your whole life. And if you see a thing of chlorine, there's like poison control stuff on it. You can't drink chlorine. So just that we can encounter sodium chloride doesn't mean that we find it edible or it's non-poisonous to us. Doesn't mean that if we took salt apart, that also the parts would be non-poisonous to us, right? And that's how fallacy of division works. All right, so and that brings us to the homework review 3.4. I'll go over this in a separate video. Thing to keep in mind, again, don't confuse fallacy and division. I memorized this by the fact that composition has a P in it. It goes from parts, and then it's got O in it to whole, and whole has an O, so parts to whole. That's how I remember the difference. But you know, even in terms of teaching them, I often have to stop and think which ones are which. So don't confuse division and composition together, and also don't confuse begging the question with, right? Don't confuse begging the question with complex question either, and that's oftentimes a mistake that some of my students make. All right, so that's this example, and so remember, keep thinking logically, and we'll go over the fallacy identification in the next section. I do like the fact that this one has groupings with like 2. But and then the 4 with fallacy presumption. The groupings do make sense. It's just that in terms of presenting them, there's just as much of in these 3 groups as just like weak induction had all those sub varieties, right? So it's about the same, even though there's 3 groupings, it's about the same as like section 3.3 in terms of content, in terms of how much is here. So don't make the wrong conclusion that just because there's a few groupings that there's not a lot of content in 3.4, right? Because there is. Okay.